I'm Josh Rosenberg, and on behalf of the Pomona Student Union, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's panel on the obligation to aid. Thanks to everyone for coming out. If you could take a moment now to silence your cell phones, I'd really appreciate it. For those of you who don't know, the Pomona Student Union is a nonpartisan student-run organization dedicated to promoting honest and open discourse on campus. The views expressed in this event do not necessarily represent those of the PSU or its members. Please visit our website, psu.pomona.edu, for information about upcoming events or to view videos of past events. Now, let me begin by setting the scene for our current debate. Believe it or not, the question of what the affluent world should be doing to reduce developing world poverty is actually a relatively new one. For most of human history, the vast majority of people were poor. It's true that there was a tiny group of elites sitting at the top of most societies, but nearly all populations were subject to the whims of disease and natural resources. Then the Industrial Revolution changed all of that. Suddenly, industrialized countries entered a cycle of increasing technology and wealth that raised the living standards of hundreds of millions of people significantly. Meanwhile, the non-industrialized countries remained in poverty, subject to the whims of nature and more powerful countries. So it's really only in the last 200 years that humans have had the means to escape poverty on a large scale, but it has not extended those means to everyone. Now, in a way that we weren't after the Industrial Revolution, we are fully aware of the extent of global inequality. Technology and globalization have changed the moral landscape. We are constantly bombarded with images of extreme poverty in advertisements or news articles or when walking through cities. An increasingly globalized economy makes it so that our consumption habits and political decisions can address and cause poverty in places far from home. These circumstances seem to have raised a new and difficult ethical question. Given that global inequality exists, and we have knowledge of it and the means to reduce it, what are we obligated to do? It is from this baseline that we should approach the problem. Within the general question of the obligation of aid, I'd like to distinguish a couple of different issues that we'll be focusing on tonight. First, there's the issue of how much relatively wealthy individuals in a wealthy state are obligated to aid in cases where the poor are facing known imminent serious harm. Within the category of possible imminent serious harms, there are harms that could be resolved with one, rather quick treatment, and harms that require ongoing aid to be avoided. Examples of the former are the eradication of treatable epidemics like SARS and H1N1 and certain disaster relief situations. Examples of the latter are consistent retroviral treatment for AIDS victims or a long-term project like diminishing malaria. These sorts of issues are what we will consider first tonight. The second half of our event will focus on cases of non-imminent serious harm. If no one is immediately suffering but standards of living are greatly unequal, do we have any obligation to aid then? If so, to what extent? We will also consider myriad other questions like the effectiveness of aid and whether we have stronger obligations to people who live in our community and country than we do to people halfway across the world. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Deborah Satz is the Marta Sutton Weeks Professor of Ethics and Society, a Professor of Philosophy, and a Professor of Political Science at Stanford University. She is the recipient of several awards, including the Walter J. Gores Award, Stanford's highest award for teaching. She is also the author of a book about the ethics of markets called Why Some Things Should Not Be for Sale, The Moral Limits of the Market. David Schmitz, to my right, is Kendrick Professor of Philosophy, Joint Professor of Economics, and Founding Director of the Center for Philosophy of Freedom at the University of Arizona. The University of Arizona was recently ranked #1 in political philosophy according to Philosophical Gourmet. He is the author of Rational Choice and Moral Agency, Elements of Justice, and Person, Polis, Planet. His articles have appeared in various journals including Political Theory, Journal of Philosophy, and Ethics. Please join me in welcoming our speakers. I have just a few more things before we begin. First, I want to note that we'll be spending some time talking about the actual effectiveness of aid, but it will not be our primary focus. If that's something you're interested in, there's a new club on campus called Evaluate, where students discuss the potential effectiveness of specific charities and particular aid interventions. If you'd like to find out more about Evaluate, please put your name and email address on the sheet of paper on the table in the lobby when you leave. Second, I'd like to thank Professor Julia Tannenbaum and Professor Andrew Schroeder for helping me with some of the framing for this event. I'd also like to thank the entire PSU board for support in every aspect of the event, and I'd like to thank the Public Events Committee as well. And finally, I'll give the structure of the event. We'll begin with Professor Satz, who will have 7 minutes to answer the first question, and then Professor Schmitz will have 7 minutes to respond. After that, we'll have about 16 minutes of discussion, and then we'll move on to the next question with the same format. So, without further ado, let's begin. The first question. Okay, we'll start out rather generally. Do we have an obligation to aid in cases of imminent serious harm, like the cases I laid out? And if so, what is the nature of that obligation?
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? My mic is on. So let me just quickly use a few seconds of my scarce time to thank the organizers of the event, especially Josh, for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be in conversation up here with David Schmitz, and I'm really looking forward to having a conversation with all of you. So thanks. And I also want to just note that today is World AIDS Day, and it's actually good to reflect on that, because if we're thinking about effectiveness of aid in the battle against AIDS, we've actually made tremendous progress, and there's a lot we can feel really good about. There's a long way to go, but it's a case where concerted action in the developed world has made a difference to the lives of people around the world and the lives of our own citizens. Okay, so topic is our obligations to others. And I want to start by framing that for 1 minute by putting out what I'll call the unhappy facts. And those unhappy facts go like this. About half of the world's people, some 3 billion of our fellow travelers on the planet, live on less than $2.50 a day, and 1 billion of those are children. According to UNICEF, about 30,000 children die every day due to poverty. That's 18 children dying every minute, or a child dying every 3 seconds. About 1.1 billion people in developing countries have inadequate access to water, and 2.6 billion lack basic sanitation. About 2.2 million children die each year because they're not immunized. Now, all or almost all of these deaths are preventable. Certainly, we have enough food to feed everyone, and we have the technology to provide basic immunizations and sanitation for all. At the same time that this is happening, the assets of the top 3 billionaires are more than the combined GNP of all the least developed countries in the world, and there's 600 million people. So global poverty, I want you to, in framing this, global poverty is a human disaster. It's not a natural disaster. It's not just a fact of nature that we have to accommodate ourselves to. It's the product of an awful mismatch between available resources and human needs. So that's the unhappy facts. And now the ethical question is, what should our response be to those facts? What are we obligated to do about them, particularly we who, in effect, are probably part of the top 1%. So if we think from the point of view of the globe, if not the top 1%, way up there. So I don't know any better way of beginning to think about this topic than with an example that was meant as an analogy offered by Peter Singer in his essay, Famine, Affluence, and Morality. It's probably the most widely taught essay in ethics, and in philosophy, so probably a lot of you have read it. How many of you know Peter Singer's essay? So a good proportion of you. So let me just, for those of you who don't, just lay it out, because it's simple and powerful. Of course, it gives rise to lots of questions, and there are lots of places to kind of think through its implications philosophically, but it is an amazingly powerful example. So Singer says, imagine you're walking by a pond and you observe a drowning child who you could rescue. It's a shallow pond with little cost and no risk to yourself. So Singer concludes in that case, quote, you ought to wade in and pull out the child, unquote. You'd be doing something seriously wrong if you didn't do that. Indeed, you would seem to be something of a moral monster if your reason for not going into the pond was because you had bought a pair of new shoes and you didn't want them to get wet. So, simple example. Most people think, in hearing that example, yeah, the right thing to do we'll talk about the thing you're obligated to do is to go into the pond. Now, the reason this is a powerful example, and people, when the essay was first published in 1971, saw it as a powerful example, is because it has some features that are analogous to our relations with people in the international scene in the unhappy facts I described. So what are some facts, what are some parameters of the example? Well, you're a stranger to the child. You don't stand in any particular relationship to the child. You're not hypothesized to be the child's parent, friend, co-national. The child is a stranger to you. Don't know the child. Second, you aren't assumed to have any responsibility for the child being in the water. You're not assumed to have pushed the child in. So whatever obligation you have, whatever force you feel of the fact of an obligation, doesn't arise from your own responsibility for the child being in the water. So no relation to the child, you don't stand in any particular relation, and you're not causally responsible. How did I almost run out of time? Okay. No, I'm kidding. And the third feature is that it's irrelevant from the point of the example whether the child themselves is responsible for being in the water. Now, Singer plays with us a little bit because it's a child and we tend to think children aren't responsible, but change the example to a frail adult and you'll still feel the force, I think, that you'd be obligated to go in if you could do so at no risk, no known risk to yourself and at very little cost. So Singer uses this to push at, by analogy, our obligations in the international realm. Because what he's in effect saying is, to you, to us, me, every time you go out for dinner, instead of giving the money to Oxfam, you're in effect walking by a child who's drowning who your life can save, your dollars could save. Now, there are a lot of empirical questions there, but I think you can see the force of the analogy. And so I just want to make 2 points, since this is just an initial foray into the topic. One is I want to point out, although I think everybody sees the force of the example and agrees that you ought, in that case, morally ought to go in and pull out the child, people disagree about how to understand that ought. And that's a disagreement between different political philosophies. So, for example, between libertarians and non-libertarians, where a lot of libertarians will say the ought in this case is something it would be good to do, but it's not something that you should be coerced to do, right? So nobody should have the right to force you to pull out the child. Rather, you're morally criticizable if you don't, but the ought doesn't imply, it doesn't justify state coercion of the action. So it's a place people disagree. I actually think, I disagree with the libertarians who tend to think that the only oughts that can be enforced are what are sometimes called negative rights, when you're actually harming, when you actually push the child in, then you can be coerced or obligated. I think in this case, as in many cases of desperate urgent needs, this is a sort of scholastic debate. We all recognize the power of that, of the example and of the obligation, and I think we have good grounds for saying in urgent cases like this, we ought to find ways for people to discharge that duty, and that there's at least a prima facie case if it can't be discharged through voluntary action to use the coercive power of the state in order to enforce this action. And we do that partly through distributive taxation is one way of thinking of it. Lots of societies and lots of states have what are called guilty bystander laws, where people are actually held accountable if in a situation where a child is drowning where they could do something, they simply walk by and neglect them. So one point I want to make is there's a lot of debate and discussion about how we understand that ought, and I'm hopefully in the discussion going to be able to develop the idea that the ought is compatible with some kind of coercive state institution that just redistributes some of your aid. And the second point I quickly want to make is that one of the things people always think about in the Singer case is how much do I have to give? And Singer himself, in his initial formulation of the problem, was very demanding. He said, not only are you obligated to jump in to save the child, but you're obligated to keep doing this until it comes to the point when you sacrifice something of equal moral importance. It's a very demanding principle. It's partly because Singer is a utilitarian who thinks that what matters is well-being, and there's decreasing utility of well-being, so well-being matters more at the very bottom, and so you ought to keep acting and transferring well-being until you're at the same point. We don't have to agree with Singer about that. Singer himself modified his proposal, and for those of you who've read his most recent work, he now says what we ought to do is give 1% of our income away, and it's a pragmatic concession. It's not a philosophic concession. He still holds the philosophic view, but the pragmatic concession is one that many different philosophical theories could converge on. I think it's worth thinking about that. When we're trying to answer the question, what is our obligation, I'm going to invoke once again the importance of thinking politically and from the point of view of the state, because if I'm trying to figure out how much I should give, I think there's no way for me to answer that question independent of knowing what the rest of you are doing. So it makes sense for me to give. In the case of aid, depends on what everybody else is giving. And there's a collective action problem. I should give my fair share, but my fair share depends. I don't even know what my fair share is until we together figure out a fair share. And that's another place where I think institutions are important in answering the question, what is the extent of my obligation? So I think at that point, I'm out of time. Thanks.
Yeah, first, thank you. Thanks to Josh and everyone who was involved in organizing this. Thank you for coming out tonight. Thanks for caring. It's an honor and a treat to share the microphone with Deborah Satz. She's among the wisest and sanest and smartest people in the profession. And I will follow suit to make a few remarks about Peter Singer and how he's inspired us to think about aid. Notice that the topic is not about what the government should do, even if we get to that eventually. The question is, what should you and I do tonight with whatever we've got in our pockets, with whatever room we've got in our credit cards right now? Singer stresses that pious talk is not enough. In his words, what's the point of relating philosophy to public affairs if we don't take our conclusions seriously? And in this case, taking our conclusions seriously means acting on it. So what is the conclusion? He may ask you to give 1% of your income, and there's a story you can tell about why that's the right thing for him to say. But what he actually believes is something different. It is that principle that Deborah stated: if we can prevent something bad without sacrificing anything of comparable importance, we should do it. Or maybe it's anything significant, but Singer says the strong interpretation seems to be the correct one. And what he means is, in his words, that one would, truly being moral, one would reduce oneself to very near material circumstances of a Bengali refugee, the sort of people that were starving when he originally wrote that article. Now, Singer, of course, hasn't given anything like that himself. By his own account, he gives about 25% of his income. So why the gap? Well, Singer says that there's something wrong with him, and I don't agree. I think the way he lives is admirable. It's his theory that I have reservations about, and I don't think that they're just ivory tower reservations. Utilitarianism is supposed to be, first of all, it's not supposed to be about how much we should sacrifice. It's about how much we can achieve. So that principle focuses on the wrong thing, even from a utilitarian perspective. You've done the right thing not when you're really suffering, but when you're really achieving. You're supposed to do something to make the world more prosperous. Better educated, better fed, longer life expectancy. So theorists need to acknowledge that moral theorizing, it isn't a game that you win by having the most demanding theory. Related thought, if you believe, as utilitarians do, that morality is about maximizing the good, then reducing the whole program of the good to a matter of alleviating suffering, think about what an impoverished idea, conception of good that is. So it would be hard to compare the good of building the Statue of Liberty to the good of building a soup kitchen, but although it's admittedly a hard comparison, you wouldn't want everyone to throw all they've got into building soup kitchens. The point is, not only is there something about that Singer principle that makes it psychologically unfit for human beings, even including the person who's its designer and foremost exponent, there's also the idea that if we did live by it, it wouldn't be a good thing. The thing that we'd be producing is a world where there's an awful lot of people, maybe with life expectancies of 90 years, and they don't have anything to do. There's no art, there's no books, there's no sport, there's just soup kitchens. So if that bothers you at all, then you should want to know, as Deborah does, what exactly is the theory that carves out room for you to have a life of your own? So what is it that carves out room for Peter Singer to also write articles on animal experimentation, to take care of his elderly mother who's got Alzheimer's, which he spends $40,000 a year doing? All the other things that make up a real life. Because that is the theory that would have a chance of telling the truth about what we owe to strangers, as well as what we owe to ourselves and to our loved ones. Another thought, related thought, I said utilitarians believe that morality is about maximizing the good. Well, I think it's plausible to say that there's several orientations toward the good that would make sense. And maximizing the good, that is one of them. But it's not the only sensible attitude. Sometimes the good commands respect. Sometimes we should be trying to promote achievement. Sometimes we should just be trying to respect it. Another related thought, if we were talking about respecting persons, a lot of philosophers talk about the idea that truly respecting people involves respecting some status that they have as separate persons. Maybe you don't like that idea. A lot of utilitarians do, but a lot of them don't. But think about it. If we interpret that principle straightforwardly, Singer's principle from a utilitarian perspective, it seems to call on us to ship food whenever we can ship it to people who have a better use for it than we do, until the point where we're kind of tied for the worst off situation in the world. That's how much food we're supposed to ship. Maybe you can say, hey, I'm willing to bite that bullet from a utilitarian perspective. Morality is tough, that's the way it is. Think about it. Before you answer that, consider that the same point applies to toxic waste. Shipping toxic waste to where it will do the least harm also is a way of preventing something bad from happening without causing anything comparably bad. So if we truly accept that principle, we'll ship barges full of stuff to East Africa, currently having a very difficult time with drought. And sometimes those barges the ship will come in full of grain, no matter what it did to our personal projects. Sometimes the ship will come in full of toxic waste, no matter what it does to their personal projects. From a utilitarian perspective, just do the math. It's all the same. So we need a better theory, not only for what I said a minute ago, for explaining why sending 25% of your income would be admirable, but also for saying why sending 25% of our toxic waste wouldn't be. Hunger, it's like an empty bucket. You want to turn on the spigot and fill that bucket, and thereby prove that your heart is in the right place. Now, what if the bucket has no bottom? Do you crank that spigot anyway? Why? Would that prove that your heart is in the right place? Here's an aphorism for you. If you're trying to prove that your heart is in the right place, it isn't. If your heart is truly in the right place, it isn't about the press conference, it's about solving the problem. And Singer would agree, to fill the bucket, we need to fix the bucket. And he would say that today. Instead of throwing food into a bottomless pit, the question is, what actually works? So there's an organization called Kiva. It's a micro-lender that helps small businesses grow. Singer's become a fan of microbanks, so have I. Maybe more important, respond to people as producers, not as consumers. Buy their stuff. We're not talking about people who are nothing more than mouths to feed. They aren't just stomachs, they've got minds, they've got hearts. Think of them as producers. There is a terrible mismatch, but it's a mismatch of opportunities to be productive and to engage in commerce. If you want to help them produce, buy their products. All they want is a chance to stand or fall by their own merit, a chance for their kids to grow up healthy and free. And then the last thing is, find immigrants next door who are sending their money back home. Buy their stuff, because the amount that they send home in the form of remittances dwarfs all other forms of international aid, at least from what I've read. You think you need to use force to give other people, to get them to do their share. Not so much. Millions of your neighbors are giving more than you are. World Bank estimates that there's $200 billion a year in remittances got sent home in 2010. The OECD Development Corporation estimates that $129 billion was the total government foreign aid budget. So it's a lot, not enough, but remittances were a lot more than that. Thanks.
Would you like to respond, Mr. Satz?
So let me just say one thing about the Singer example, because I think one of the reasons I think the example is so powerful, so the example of, in the face of urgent need, if you could do something at small cost to redress an urgent need, you ought to do so. I think it resonates across a lot of different world views. That one doesn't have to be a utilitarian to accept that principle. One doesn't have to think you have to maximize the, so utilitarians, for those of you who are not philosophers, say that the right thing to do is to maximize well-being of the greatest number of people. That's a particular principle. Peter Singer himself believes it, but one doesn't have to sign on to the principle to sign on to the idea that urgent needs that are redressable, that we could redress at not severe cost, we ought to do so. And that's the point of the drowning child example. Now, there are empirical questions here about, first, can we really redress these urgent needs at relatively low cost? And there are debates both about the efficacy of aid, about the causes of the urgent needs of the poor. So we can, and those are very, very important debates. But I think the principle doesn't require any adherence to the sort of views that David was attacking, rightly, with the views that the only thing that matters is well-being, the views that we ought to pull ourselves down, and therefore it will sort of undermine well-being if we do this. I don't have to sign on to any of those to think the Singer basic principle is correct. There's still going to be a question about, what is an urgent need, and what happens, how should we think about our obligations beyond urgent needs? Do they just evaporate? Do we have any obligations once we've redressed urgent needs? And there's a question, which I think is a serious question, about how much should I do? So I said, I like to think about this institutionally because I have a hard time answering the question, what should I do? I mean, the Singer example is misleading in this one way. The Singer example is you on the beach with the one kid and you, but in the real world, there are millions of us and millions of kids in the water.
So what would be the proper way of thinking about it institutionally? And what's your justification for thinking about it that way rather than just at the individual level?
So I think about it this way. Well, first I think a lot of world poverty is itself explained by bad institutions, so that it's, if you look at the places where there's urgent need, it's often places with weak governance, civil wars, no infrastructure, no distribution systems, so institutions matter in that way. But I also think it's a little bit like if you asked me, what is the correct, how much taxes should I pay in the United States? I have no way of answering that question without thinking about what's my fair share. And to think about my fair share, I have to think about, first of all, I couldn't calculate it. I need a set of institutions to help me calculate it. And so I think that's a role institutions could play. And people have talked about having a global fund that we would all pay taxes into. There would be some way of thinking about what the fair shares were, and then people would pay taxes into that and it would be distributed. But I absolutely agree that the singer is directed to you and to me because we don't have those institutions now, and we're in a world where we have to do something.
Comment on that?
Well, sure. Some work has been done. Amartya Sen won a Nobel Prize largely for his work on the causes of famine. And his conclusion was that in the 20th century, there were no major famines where the best explanation had to do with drought or fire or floods or anything like that. It was every place where there were major famines, there also actually was plenty of food right there to feed people, and some of those countries were exporting food at the time that people were starving. So it is a case of degenerate and corrupt institutions being systematically implicated in widespread famines, at least from the 20th century on. Now, one way I would counsel thinking about this is there's a sort of game theoretic ecological problem called the tragedy of the commons. How many people have heard of that? Okay, a lot of you have heard of that too. So, but the idea is that if you have a bunch of shepherds and they have access to communal food as a resource, then they will tend to overgraze. And the worst thing isn't just the possibility of the shepherds adding more sheep than they otherwise would if they get 100% of the benefit of adding the sheep and they only pay an nth of the cost, and so they do it even though it's a collective disaster. The worst thing is not when the shepherds add extra sheep. It's when extra shepherds themselves show up on the scene, when people flood in to take advantage of such things, and you see it play out in different guises throughout history and all over the world. And so if you don't want people to turn their land into Sahara, then you don't want that land to be governed communally. It's one of the main first results that come out of ecology, and for that matter, game theory. So that's not to say that you're not supposed to help. That's not the implication at all. The implication is the obvious thing, be an unconditional cooperator, just throw what you've got at the problem. That actually isn't the solution.
So you're saying that the tragedy of the commons is like charitable giving, in that if everyone were to throw themselves at the problem, there'd be too much aid?
Oh, no. No, I think that at most could be true in the short run. But you could think of something like this. I mean, play with permutations of that shallow pond. So suppose, okay, there's a baby in the pool, and the thing that would save the baby's life is if you give $100 to a dictator right now. So you do it, and then the dictator throws 2 more babies in. So at what point should you stop throwing $100 at the dictator? Now, I'm not saying that the situation is like that, and I think actually technology is helping us a bit because it's harder for these folks to get away with just taking the money at the border and using it to build palaces and buy guns and so on. But there has been a fair amount of that in history, and Singer himself is sensitive to it. And he said, look, my principle never said do what doesn't work. I said do what did work. That was the idea. But it's not easy to figure out what does work. And I've been in a lot of countries, which isn't to say I know much about what's going on there, but talking to diplomats, talking to people working for NGOs in Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, South Africa, different countries, Guatemala, they say actually our loss of autonomy and our loss of individual accountability is the worst problem we have. It's not that the aid hasn't helped, it's not that we don't want it, but it starts coming in, it starts doing some good, and then it grows, and as soon as it grows, it becomes a target, and it gets captured by the people who have the most money to invest in capturing it. And it ends up bringing down local governments and so on. So it's a problem.
Okay. Perhaps we should move on to the second half for right now. Professor Schmitz, do you want to start? The question is, if no one is immediately suffering, but standards of living are greatly unequal, do we have any obligation to aid them, and if so, to what extent?
Okay, so there's a former colleague, political theorist and a lawyer, Bruce Ackerman. He asked us to think about the requirements of egalitarian justice by imagining that we're on a spaceship looking for new worlds to colonize. And so I'm quoting him now. He says, coming unexpectedly upon a new world, we scan it from afar and learn that it contains only a single resource, manna, a biblical gift from heaven. We decide to make this new world our home. As we approach a planet, the spaceship is alive with talk. Since manna is in short supply and universally desired, the question of its initial distribution is on everyone's mind. We instruct the autopilot to circle the planet for the time it takes to resolve the question of initial distribution, and we proceed to the assembly hall to discuss the matter for, okay, problem. What if the planet is inhabited? So Ackerman can stipulate, no, it's my thought experiment, I can make up the rules. I stipulate that the planet is uninhabited. Okay, fine, but what if the planet is inhabited? What if the planet is like Earth? It's not an idle question. Ackerman wants his thought experiment to illuminate what we owe each other here on Earth. So as we circle over that planet dreaming about dividing this up, my question remains, are goods on Earth like manna found on an uninhabited planet? Or are the real goods that Ackerman wants to produce, not just a thought experiment, are those goods here and now typically goods that have already been discovered, created, manufactured, possessed, and put to use by someone else? Philosophers have long sought to identify the essence of justice by asking what people would agree to if they came to, the spaceship is meant to be a cool way of illustrating that, if they came to a bargaining table to negotiate the outlines of the society in which they would subsequently live. So Ackerman is right about this much. If bargainers were looking at a heap of manna on the table, wondering how to divide it, it wouldn't take very long for someone to propose that the goods be divided into equal shares. And that would make a lot of sense in those circumstances, for a lot of reasons. Well, what if we change the context? Is this a small change or a big change? Suppose the people don't arrive at the table simultaneously. It's the sort of thing that Singer would call irrelevant. But suppose a native tribe got there first. Now the ship's passengers and crew are talking about how to divide the tribe's possessions, and someone shyly asked, what exactly was it that made dividing their possessions our business? Or suppose that people are born one by one over generations so that when a new person arrives, there are no unowned goods sitting on a table awaiting fair division. The goods are already claimed by others, largely products of lifetimes of work. We know right away that we'll have a harder time knowing what to count as an equal share, knowing what to count as a new arrival's share. We may still conclude with Ackerman, very well might, that justice requires some kind of equal share. But clearly we're in a different situation requiring a different approach. Justice would be simpler if the world were as lacking in history as the worlds we imagine in our philosophy experiments, our contractarian thought experiments. But for better or worse, we and our communities have history, and history matters. The point isn't that the past must be respected no matter what. The point is that there are ways of respecting the past that enable people to have mutually respectful and mutually beneficial futures. We know this, and yet still we talk as if justice, as if respect, right? Justice is about how to divide what people contribute rather than how to respect what people contribute. Society isn't a race. In a race, people need to start on an equal footing. Why? Well, because a race's purpose is to measure relative performance. By contrast, a society's purpose is not to measure relative performance, but to be a good place to live. To be a good place to live, a society needs to be a place where people do not face arbitrary bias or exclusion. In liberal society at its best, women, men, blacks, whites, people of all religions have a real chance to live well as free and responsible individuals. People need a good footing, not an equal footing. The goal is to improve prospects, not to equalize them. It wouldn't be a tragedy if your kids have a better shot than you do. It's a good thing, not a bad thing. We have such things as universities today. To attend them, a person no longer needs to be male or white or rich. And that's progress, not because opportunities are more equal, but because opportunities are better. Same point, I think, applies in the international arena. I don't think citizenship is that big a deal here. David Miller reflects that if someone in France were getting far better health care than Miller was getting in England, Miller's first instinct would be to suspect that France has a better system and England should consider adopting it. Not that resources ought to be transferred from France to England so as to reduce inequality. Well, why? He's an egalitarian. Well, because the main point of Miller's egalitarianism is to improve life prospects, not equalize them. So there is room within a genuinely liberal theory for egalitarianism that's focused on improving rather than leveling life chances, on removing barriers to people bettering themselves, not because barriers entrench inequality, but because barriers are barriers. There's a difference between humane treatment and equal treatment. Humanitarianism is a concern for how well people are faring. Egalitarianism is a concern for how people are faring relative to each other. So there are some egalitarians who say that humanitarianism and egalitarianism are two unrelated concerns and we have to choose. So Larry Kempton says that as a characterization of an egalitarian's core concern, humanitarianism is a non-starter. Well, that's Temkin. Outside the academy, though, liberal and inside the academy, too, if you talk to Deborah Satz, David Miller, and Liz Anderson, and a few. But outside the academy, anyway, liberal egalitarianism has this older populist tradition that deployed the concept of meritocracy against, not against equality, against hereditary aristocracy. Even the socialist tradition was once partly a meritocratic reaction to a social hierarchy that prevented workers from getting the wages that they deserved. Meritocratic liberalism fought against elitism, not for it. That's a travesty of history to say otherwise. It fought against elitism, and liberalism won. Liberalism won that battle so decisively that today we don't remember that that battle had to be fought. In the West today, no one expects us to bow to our superiors. No matter how rich or poor we are, the proper way for us to introduce ourselves is with a handshake. which implies that we meet as equals. That's mundane, but the very fact that it's mundane is inspiring. When Martin Luther King said, "I have a dream that my 4 children will one day live in a nation where they'll be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character," he was dreaming of a world in which his children would someday be able to count on equal treatment, not equal shares. He was dreaming of a kind of equality that isn't antithetical to meritocracy, but is instead meritocracy's moral foundation. Okay, so last thing. Suppose we have a certain moral worth, and there's nothing that we can do to make ourselves more worthy or less. In that case, well, we might turn out to be of equal worth. Now, instead, suppose that along some dimensions, our moral worth can be affected by our choices. Well, in that case, realistically, there will never be an instant when we're all of equal worth along those dimensions. So, what is the true, honest point, then, of the liberal ideal of political equality? It's not to stop us from becoming more worthy along dimensions where our worth can be affected by our choices, but to facilitate our becoming more worthy. The liberal political equality was not premised on an absurd hope that under ideal conditions we turn out to be equally worthy. It only presupposes a classically liberal optimism regarding the kind of society that results from giving people, all people, so far as this is realistically feasible, a chance to choose worthy ways of life.
So I'm going to go back to the singer for a second and assume that all of you feel the force of the singer example, that you recognize a norm that gives you reasons to act in the case of extreme urgent need. Now I want to ask, in the international realm, do we have other kinds of obligations or other norms that could play a role? And many people, many thinkers have thought, and many people think, that in the international realm, the relevant norm is the humanitarian norm. That is, what we have reason to do in the international realm is to deal with urgent needs. In the domestic realm, however, other norms apply. And to think about why other norms apply, you might think in the case of the United States that even if the government were meeting the urgent needs of its citizens, but, for example, were distributing benefits to men as opposed to women, there's another norm here that's very important. Or you might think it wouldn't be enough. Not only is there some norm of equal benefit, but there's an inclusion norm, right? That people have to be consulted and included in decision-making in the domestic context, and they need the resources in order to be fully included in the domestic context. So some people have drawn a sharp distinction between the domestic context, where many norms and more demanding norms than just meeting urgent need apply, and the international realm, where the relevant norm is argued to just be humanitarianism, understood as a concern with the absolute level of somebody's position. So Tom Nagel wrote a piece, but really bringing up an old idea. For those of you who've read Hobbes, Nagel differs from Hobbes in very significant ways, but the idea is, look, within the state, where we share institutions, certain norms get a hold of us because we want the institutions to treat people fairly. Where there are no sets of institutions, those kinds of norms can't get a hold. And so Nagel says in the international realm, the only thing we are to care about is absolute level, and comparisons or egalitarian considerations really don't get any purchase on us. So I want to just think about that with you, because I don't accept quite that sharp a distinction, and I want to think about the ways and places that the distinction might be blurred. So one thing I want to think about is, at the very least, the idea that in the domestic case, relative position might matter. So even to take David's example about schooling, it's true that we have competitive applications for schooling, but we care about, it wouldn't be enough to improve the position, let's say, of the most poor students in society. If we improve the position of the well-off students to such an extent that they had capture over access to college, right? So that you could basically buy your way into college. That's not meritocracy. We care about fairness in distribution. So we care about relative position. I think in the international context, relative considerations can matter. And that's just to notice that sometimes the absolute level of where people stand has a relative dimension. So the easiest example to see this in, and there are a lot of examples, but I'll give you one from Adam Smith. So Adam Smith says, if you want to think about the fundamental thing people need, kind of the minimum that they need the ability to appear in public without shame. Classic. But if you think about the ability to appear in public without shame, what determines its content? It's relational. Right? You can't know what it takes to appear, what it took to appear in public without shame in 1300 in Europe is different than what it takes to appear in public without shame today. There's a relational aspect. And that means a lot of, for some goods, the absolute position has a relative dimension. What it takes to be poor in the United States, you look like a king in some parts of the world. But that doesn't mean you're not poor, because there's a relative level. So at the very least, when we're thinking about determining the absolute level of people's needs, sometimes we set that level, relatively speaking. So that's the first point I want to make. And the second point I want to make is that just as in the domestic context, when we have international, when we have institutions which are institutions we contribute to or are members of, that puts constraints on how those institutions can act legitimately. So take in the international realm, this is just to show you that there's more than humanitarian norms at stake. We have a bunch of international institutions. We have the World Health Organization, the International Labor Organization. These organizations have a set of rules. Right? They have members and they have rules. If tomorrow the International Labor Organization decided to change its rules, right, and suddenly no longer allow labor to have any voice in the determination of policy, I think most of us would say you can't just change the rules. If organizations are set up, right, to meet the needs of all or all groups, they're at the very least process norms of how these institutions should be governed. And we have a whole set of institutions that we can look at in terms of process norms. How does the WTO make decisions? There are lots of different arguments that are made about WTO, World Trade Organization, decision making. We can think about how trade rules are set and whose voice gets to count, and that there could be egalitarian or deliberative norms or norms of inclusion that go beyond the humanitarian norms that the Singer example appeals to. And what that does is, if you think that's true, it doesn't say that the domestic realm is exactly the same as the international realm, but it says as the world becomes more interrelated and we have more common institutions, the boundaries get blurrier, and the kinds of norms that give us reason to act actually converge.
Would you like to respond to this?
Well, maybe I also feel the same way about crossing borders. To me, there may be some respects in which that is a morally portentous crossing, but I think when it comes to obligations of equal treatment and so on, I don't accept that that's a really sharp distinction either. When I think about equal treatment, it sounds to me like there's, I don't think that there's much limit to the moral force of the case for a kind of equality of treatment, the idea of equal citizenship. And somehow, you know, when a person isn't a citizen, that isn't the same. Equal citizenship isn't the same for non-citizens, but a lot of it survives as well. A lot of the moral case for how we ought to treat people. But I think another thing when it comes to equality of condition, like you said, there are, if you look at what we call poverty here, it's, I mean, there are extremely poor people here, but if you look at the 20th percentile, that's not that poor. Or the 14th or 16th percentile, it's a moving, the poverty line is a moving thing in percentile terms. But if you look at 14 or 16%, wherever it is currently, they're not all that poor by historical terms and by world terms. And I don't mean to say that makes it something to be proud of. What I mean to say is something good did happen. And whatever it was, the good thing that happened, it didn't happen overnight. And if that good thing is going to happen anywhere else, it's probably not going to be overnight. And so, I mean, this is a terrible thing to say, but I don't see any way around it, is that getting the kind of results that we want in terms of fostering worldwide prosperity, it's going to take a long time. And efforts to solve the problem overnight are going to tend to make things worse. And there's a prospect of taking a position, you know, as opposed to asking what are we really interested in here, taking a position that, well, whatever happens, here's my position, this is what has to happen, equality now, no matter what the cost. You're going to find out that the cost of pursuing equality that way is going to be really large and larger than it needs to be. I'm mindful of the fact that when it talks about, you know, being too poor to appear in public without shame, a lot of the people at that poverty line are people out there. I mean, maybe you're in the 1%, but probably a lot of you statistically are around the poverty line, and maybe you shouldn't be. Maybe it shouldn't be calculated that way, but that is the way it's calculated. You're making under $17,000 a year or something like that. And it doesn't matter what your expenses are, that makes you a poor household. So what's that worth? I don't know. But the thing is, the people who don't have the kind of money to buy really cool clothes and things are going to tend to be people who are young, and it's not going to continue. They are going to have the money to buy those clothes someday. Now I'm talking about domestically, I'm not talking about worldwide poverty, but historically our poverty in the United States isn't that much different from poverty in other countries. It was in 1870 that our per capita GDP passed Mexico's. This is once a pretty poor country. And if you look at the year 1900, the life expectancy was 43 years. That's for whites. For blacks, it was 32 years. If you look at the year 2000, the life expectancy was 73 years for whites. For blacks, it was 68. There was still a difference of 5.5 years. Now, I think you could look at that and say, well, it's unconscionable that race would make a difference of 5.5 years in life expectancy. That's a big difference. Although It's not that big compared to the difference between 32 and 68. So whatever it is that boosted the life expectancy from 32 to 68 and from 43 to 73, that isn't something you want to mess with. That isn't, you don't want to change that from happening again this semester, hopefully without world wars and genocide. So there's a risk of thinking that the prize is equality when it just isn't.
Sure, we can throw it.
Okay. Can we thank our speakers? Any questions? You can just raise your hand. Yeah.
Okay. I have been thinking about how to make this thing, but I've lost it. I thought the point about histories was interesting because I feel like a discussion about causality would complicate the issue for both sides. Because in the case of people coming to the table, like in fair slice of the pie, whatever that is, if it's found that someone can't have a fair slice of the pie because I exploited them historically, I feel like that would create a more pressing obligation phase. But on the other hand, if the drowning child, I'd rather say something less urgent, like maybe a starving frail adult, is in that situation because he refused to go out and farm, I feel like that also complicates my obligation to aid. So, since I haven't read Singer, I'm curious as to why a discussion on causality, or why he excludes a discussion on causality, and whether or not you both think those complications apply.
Well, as to why he wouldn't take causality into account, you've got to understand what an elegantly simple theory it is. It's to say there's such a thing as the value or the good that's at stake, and in the simplest terms, it's pleasure and pain, or the minimization of pain. And if you say, well, historically, how did they get this way? At the first pass of this theorizing, that's not relevant to anything. I mean, that's like saying, well, what if that pool is 30 yards away? What if it's 300 yards away? And you say, at what point in that process does distance become relevant? At what point does time become relevant? At what point does responsibility become relevant? Now, I think Singer himself has actually, his theorizing has become much more sophisticated in recent years, so he is paying attention to things like that. So he's not officially backing off these principles, but if you look at the discussion is much more sensitive to that now, and I think it should be. I agree.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting, I mean, I definitely think there are many cases where historical causality and responsibility matter, and matter a great deal. I think the Singer point is pushing you to think that, is it the case? So supposing in the example, the child had been warned by their parent and didn't listen and went in anyway. Or supposing it was an adult who was, showing off. The person's drowning, you can save them. You might think in that context, at that point, it's not relevant. Now, that's when it gets, I agree with you, when you start thinking about, well, supposing it's their 15th time doing it, and if you pull them out again, then they're going to just go back in again because they're reckless. Is there a point at which it's unfair for them to be counting on you constantly to bail them out? Yes, that could be a good question. The Singer is sort of abstracting from that, but it's partly abstracting for a point. It wants to, what he's trying to push is the norm, right? When you could do something at a low cost to meet an urgent need that somebody has, right, it's irrelevant what the reason is. Now, the reasons could come in other places, and they certainly have a purchase on us. But the example is pushing you it's actually pushing back at the person who says, well, no, what really matters is whether they're responsible or not. If they're not responsible, then I'll save them.
I think that one thing, if you if you investigated at least what I would take to be the most serious, plausible, adult moral theories on offer, you would find that they don't give you very satisfying answers to those questions. They don't give you really precise, comforting answers. And I think it has to be okay. We have to live with that because, in fact, those theories are supposed to be giving us an honest description of what moral life is like. And moral life really is that hard. It really is that messy. It really is true that you can see your child doing these things with her life or his life, and you can say, oh, that is, yeah, like, I mean, and you're going crazy, but you think, okay, it's my child, and that's at some point the fact that this is my child just trumps everything, and it doesn't matter that you shouldn't be left holding the bag. The fact is, you have been left holding the bag. I mean, that's true, and it's also true that at some point, and there's no theoretical cutoff, and that's the hell of it. At some point, you say, you know, it doesn't matter that you're my kid. I'm sorry, but part of being a responsible parent now is to treat you like a child when you are a child. But at some point, being a responsible parent involves treating a child like an adult, namely the point when the child is an adult, and you say, like, I'm sorry, I couldn't make this problem mine I couldn't solve this problem if I wanted to. I do want to, but the fact is, I can't turn back the clock and be somehow a better parent. You are what you are, and you're just going to have to deal with it. And life is brutal. Moral life is brutal in that way. It just is.
Next question.
You talked about how we should aim for great benefit overall, not just equality, but in certain situations like in America today, studies have shown that in high-income countries, income inequality is associated with lower levels of education, lower levels of life expectancy overall. Should we aim for greater inequality? Do we have an obligation to give money to the poor in order to boost the outcomes of everybody?
Yeah. Did you say aim for greater inequality? Was that a typo?
Aim for greater inequality.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. All right. I'll say two things that kind of cut against each other. One, I don't think the point should be to aim for a greater equality under the heading, under that description, greater equality. I think there have been all kinds of episodes in American history and maybe human history where the thing to aim at really was greater equality. So you say, like, I'm sorry, you just can't enslave people. Again and again, this has come up. We didn't invent slavery. It's come up again and again. It's had to be dealt with usually in horrendous, bloody fashion again, and it just happens. At some point you say, like, do I have this right? Women can't have checking accounts. Women can't, property deeds can't be made out to women, or married women. Women, if they're married, there's no such thing as raping your wife. And you think, that's just the end of the world. And at that point, equality is precisely the thing you have to achieve or die trying, basically. I mean, that's a call. That's a call to humanity, that's a call to decency, and you can't ignore that call. Now, so I'll say that, but I think if we're talking about disparities of life expectancy and so on, no, I would not want to treat that under the heading of greater equality, right? So, kids are born with cleft palates, and so I say, should we fix that? I mean, like, there's lots of kids born normal, healthy, and Rawls will say, it isn't right that some people should have less in order that others have more. But sorry, very little of what goes on in human society is zero-sum in that way. that baby born with the cleft palate, it isn't so the next baby born healthy can have more. Like, nobody's better off with that kid being born. Nobody's advantaged by that kid being born with a cleft palate. So if you say, we've just got to go in and fix that, and we've got to vaccinate those kids, by the way, and those kids, by the way, we have to educate them for free because their parents aren't going to do it. In fact, we have to do it even if their parents forbid it. If we've got some sect that says, I think teaching my kids to read will send their soul straight to hell, we say, I'm sorry, this is a nasty thing to do to you, but your kids are going to learn to read. It's just got to be that way. So all kinds of things like that, but the point isn't the equality. The point of operating on a kid, even if the kid's parents can't pay to fix the cleft palate, is not to fix an unequal distribution of cleft palates or an unfair distribution of cleft palates. The point is to fix cleft palates, period.
So can I actually, I thought the question could be taken a bit differently, and I thought there might be a diversity of reasons to be worried about inequality. I mean, inequality is rarely objectionable in itself. There are some contexts in which it's objectionable in itself, but often it's objectionable because of consequences it has. So one thing we might worry about what's wrong with income inequality? Why should we care about income inequality? Well, you could imagine a bunch of reasons. You might care about income inequality because you think it undermines democracy. Or maybe you think that when you have very high levels of income inequality, it translates into unequal political power, and that translates into some people having more voice than others in political decision-making. A whole bunch of literature has gone the way you were suggesting, which says, well, you know, here's another interesting thing. There's disputes about the empirics of this, but supposing it's the case that just having income inequality leads to worse health outcomes for people. You know, is that a reason to care about inequality? It's not that the inequality in itself is objectionable, but supposing it turns out when we have steep inequality, we actually have worse health outcomes. Does society have a reason to care about the health outcomes of its citizens? And would that be a reason to think about there's some other good that we're interested in that promoting income inequality, promoting greater income equality is instrumental to? And I think it's rare that, I mean, we have sometimes reasons to care about procedures being fair and equal, but a lot of our objections to inequality, I think, are instrumental objections, that inequality has some effects on some values that we care about in other contexts. So I take that as an important point about the diversity of reasons you could have for objecting to inequality.
Okay, well, I'd like to just add an amendment then, just in response to the first thing you said about buying and selling political power, say. I mean, obviously that's one of the biggest problems we have in this country, and it's not a small thing. It's not just a theoretical thing. I mean, it's literally a $50 trillion problem that we've got right now. It's like more than all, you know, we're in debt more than just about the total amount of money in the world, I think. You know, think about it like this. If, I mean, I'm not a big believer in the war on drugs. I've served on a grand jury and I've seen too much. But nevertheless, suppose that you had a big problem with people buying and selling crack for $1. You don't go after people who have $1, you go after people who sell crack. And I think the thing we have to go after is not people who have enough money to buy political power, but people who are in a position to sell it, and somehow reduce the amount of power that gets bought and sold. That's the real problem, one way or another. That's the problem we have to solve.
Yes, you first.
Your initial response to Sarah, you said that we should be careful because we could be sending toxic waste when you're going to food. I couldn't understand why a utilitarian would endorse sending toxic waste instead of just purified waste.
Well, it causes so many birth defects if it's located in point A, it causes so many if it's located at point B. If that's at point A, and you should ship it to point B. That's the idea. So you ship it, maybe, could be something like this. If it's sitting in a place where the residents have life expectancies of 73 years, and it's going to shorten their life expectancy over time by so much, you say, but if we shift it over here, these people are going to die of AIDS and malaria anyway, so it's not going to shorten their life expectancy much. And you can say, well, that could be empirically true. It would still be monstrous to do that, but not for utilitarian reasons.
Yep.
So this is kind of regarding the equal treatment, equal shares discussion. So at the point at which the share you receive, whether being born a certain race, or born to a certain income bracket, if you're born to a certain school district, or being born like in a country of the global south, something like that. To the extent to which the share you receive influences the way you're treated, how does that affect the approach we take to humanitarianism and egalitarianism?
I'm actually not sure I understood the question. Could I ask you to rephrase?
So like, if you're born into a certain income bracket in the United States specifically, that influences the opportunities you receive.
Agreed, yeah.
Or on an international level, if you're born into a third world country that doesn't have a director on the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, that doesn't have a country that doesn't sit on the UN Security Council, that sort of international influence, you don't get the same, so you don't have an equal share, and that also influences the ways in which you're treated, both on an international level in terms of economic policies that are developed, and on a domestic level in terms of like the high school you get to go to even. So at the point at which the share you receive kind of influences the treatment you receive, how do we kind of alter the way in which that occurs, or alter those structures so that we can move forward?
Okay, so Josh asked, say, let's set aside whether we're talking about the difference between life and death. Let's suppose this isn't that kind of humanitarian emergency. You mean that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it applies whether or not we're talking about life or death or other sorts of non-necessary rights or privileges like education, like so yeah, I think it applies in both situations. But my question applies.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I don't have any particularly smart answer to that. I'm sorry. It really is a good question, but I can't do justice to it. All I can say really is it's important sometimes it's important not to fix what isn't actually broken. And so if you say, well, there's a disparity. I mean, if you're born in this place, your life expectancy is 5 years lower than if you're born in this place, or if your nationality is this, whatever. And so you say, well, is that a big problem? And well, whether it's a big problem depends on a lot of things. I mean, if there's an easy fix, then you ought to treat it as a problem and fix it. If in fact the cure would be worse than the disease, and what that actually is it's a characteristic, it's a temporary characteristic of a process that's actually a really good thing. I mean, if you say, well, yeah, but it was 20 years a few generations ago, or if you say, well, yeah, but that demographic, I mean, those people who are so poor, well, they're retired. I mean, their income is low. It's not that their assets, we're not talking about their assets, we're talking about their income. So you look beyond that and see, do you have a real problem that the inequality is signifying? If it's just inequality, maybe it's not really a problem. If some people are just stuck and they're not, like the other people, I mean, there's a tide, and you say a rising tide lifts all boats, and theoretically that's a possibility, but you look and say, well, it's lifting most boats. Then at some point you say, actually, not being a great fan of Rawls, but still he has a point, which is you don't want to live in that boat if over time, it's going to leave you in a situation where you've got a least advantaged class whose circumstances are appalling. At some point you say, well, no, actually we do have to compromise on something else in order to lift those boats as well. So,
One last question, perhaps for Professor Setz. Yeah.
Someday I hope to have an actual job and make some money. And I was curious if you'd be willing to put a number on what percentage of my income I'm obligated to donate to charity. Is it 1%? Is it 25? Is it whatever the government tells me it should be?
So as I said, I think, I don't think a philosopher can figure out what the exact number is, and I think it's a collective action problem, because I actually think a lot depends. How we meet our obligation, what kind of obligation we have to meet, depends in part on what other people are doing. But I'll give you a kind of cop-out answer, which is a Peter Singer-like answer, which is, look, if you were giving 5% of your income away, and actually if everybody did that, we would easily have enough in the income pool to eradicate urgent poverty. Whether we could do it is a separate question, because there's institutional context. But if you gave away 5% of your income, you would be doing, and everybody did, you'd be doing a great thing. Now, if you ask me what should I do if other people aren't doing their fair share, then that's a much harder question. I don't think you're obligated. I think that's a really hard question about how we act in non-ideal circumstances when other people don't hold up their fair share of responsibilities. But I think there's some number which, if each of us did our part, and it's not, I don't think it would impoverish us. I think actually the old idea of tithing is, long gone, but, it used to be that people tithed and they publicly showed each other what they were doing as they passed the bucket. And you did it because you don't want to be embarrassed in front of your friends. They were giving, they were tithing their income. You had to step up too. If we had some mechanism like that, I think you could meet your obligations without impoverishing yourself. I think the question of what to do in the non-ideal world is harder.
I kind of like the idea of tithing, and I don't want to leave Deborah. I don't want to leave Deborah flapping there. So I'd want to say that if there isn't any, I don't like the idea of an imposed giving because it becomes a magnet for corruption. But I think if you say, how much should I give? I think the right moral theory is going to say, you have an obligation to fit into your community in a certain way. You have an obligation to abide by collectively rational norms and that sort of thing, which might support tithing, say. And the other thing is that I think there's a lot of morality that's pretty individualistic, and it revolves around the idea of you having conversations with yourself about what makes your life worth living. And so at some point you've got to say, I tell my students, there's going to be an exam. I don't mean the exam like on May 14th or something like that. The exam I'm talking about is 50 years from now, when you are in the stages of terminal cancer or something like that, and you say, what was the point? Was I here for a reason? I think that's the exam. That's the thing that I'm trying to prepare you for. I want you to be able to say, it mattered that I was here. The world is a better place because I was here. And so I think this is an imperfect duty of the kind that Deborah and Kant talk about, to say you have to carve out for yourself some corner of the world, of the problem of making the world a better place, and say, that's my piece, and the world will, it will be true. Maybe it's only a few of my students that will know, but it will be true that the world's better because I was here.
I think that's a nice place to end it. Thank you. Could we give them one more round of applause? Thank you very much for coming. If you want to stick around and talk, we'll You're on.